The phone jolted me awake at 6:30 in the morning, its shrill ring cutting through the October quiet of my cabin. I fumbled for it in the gray light, already knowing it couldn't be good news. Emergency calls at dawn never were. Mitchell here. Dr. Mitchell, this is Sergeant Rodriguez with Washington State Police. We need your expertise on an urgent search and rescue operation in the North Cascades. How quickly can you get to the park entrance? I sat up, running a hand through my hair. 15 years of tracking wolves had earned me a reputation with local law enforcement, but they rarely called before sunrise unless someone was in serious trouble. What's the situation? Missing person. A camper named Robert Chen fled his site around midnight, and we've got some unusual circumstances. Can you be there in 2 hours? I'll be there in 90 minutes. I threw on my standard field gear, worn hiking boots, cargo pants with enough pockets for emergency supplies, and the thick wool sweater my ex-wife always said made me look like a lumberjack. The drive to the North Cascades took me through small mountain towns, still sleeping under the early morning mist, past coffee shops that wouldn't open for another hour. The park entrance buzzed with activity when I arrived. 3 police vehicles, a ranger truck, and a red pickup I didn't recognize crowded the small parking area. A cluster of officials stood near the ranger station, their breath visible in the crisp air. October in the Cascades meant temperatures that could drop into the 20s at night. Not the kind of weather you wanted to spend outdoors unprepared. A young officer broke away from the group and approached me. His nameplate read Santos, and everything about him screamed urban cop trying to look comfortable in wilderness he clearly didn't understand. His gear was too new, his boots too clean, and his eyes kept darting toward the tree line like he expected something to jump out at him. Dr. Mitchell, I'm Officer Eddie Santos. Thanks for coming out so early. Call me David. What do we know about the missing person? That's where it gets weird. Eddie pulled out a small notebook, consulting it like he was reading someone else's words. Robert Chen, 34, software engineer from Seattle, set up camp at Buck Creek yesterday afternoon. His tent mate says Chen woke up around midnight, started acting agitated, then just ran into the forest. Ran how? Disoriented? Confused? Eddie's jaw tightened. According to the witness, Chen was moving on all fours, making these low growling sounds, and his eyes were... He paused, clearly uncomfortable. Glowing. I stared at him. Glowing eyes. Officer Santos, wolves don't actually have glowing eyes. That's a myth. Eye shine from a flashlight maybe, but not actual glowing. I'm just telling you what the witness reported. The search coordinator, a weathered ranger named Thompson, joined us with a map spread across the hood of his truck. He pointed to a spot marked with red ink. Chen's campsite is here, about 3 miles up the Buck Creek Trail. His tent mate, guy named Marcus Webb, says Chen just got up and bolted. Left everything behind, sleeping bag, clothes, shoes. He's out there in nothing but pajama pants. In this weather? I looked at the temperature gauge on Thompson's truck. 38 degrees, and we were still an hour from sunrise. He'll be hypothermic by now. That's why we need to move fast. Thompson traced his finger along several trail markers. We're splitting into 3 search teams. Team 1 takes the main Buck Creek Trail. Team 2 heads west towards Sahale Creek, and you 2 get the eastern ridge. Eddie shifted nervously. Are there wolves in that area? There's a pack that ranges through the eastern ridges, I said. But they're not dangerous to humans. Wolves avoid people unless they're cornered or defending pups. What about the behavior the witness described? I pulled my own gear bag from my truck, checking that my tranquilizer gun was properly secured. The weapon was designed for sedating wolves during research captures, though I'd never had to use it in an actual emergency. No wolf moves the way Webb described. They don't run on all fours the way humans do. Their gait is completely different, and they definitely don't have glowing eyes. I shouldered my pack, testing the weight distribution. My guess is Chen was sleepwalking or having some kind of medical episode. Hypothermia can cause hallucinations and disorientation. Webb probably saw him stumbling in the dark, and his mind filled in the details. Eddie didn't look convinced. What if we actually encounter wolves out there? We won't. I handed him one of my spare GPS units. Wolves are incredibly smart. They'll hear us coming from a mile away and avoid us completely. The biggest danger is Chen himself. If he's been wandering for 6 hours in this cold, he might be in bad shape. Thompson distributed radio headsets to each team. Check in every hour. If anyone finds tracks or signs, report immediately. Weather's supposed to stay clear, but that doesn't help much if Chen's already succumbed to exposure. I clipped the radio to my belt and did a final equipment check. 50 feet of rope, first aid kit, emergency blanket, flares, water purification tablets, and enough food for 12 hours. Eddie watched me work, his own preparation consisting mainly of checking his service weapon multiple times. "You ever been on a wilderness search before?" I asked. "First time outside the city limits, actually. Stay close and watch your footing. The trails up here can be deceptive. What looks like solid ground might be loose rocks or hidden roots." I started toward the trailhead, then paused. "And Santos, if we do happen to see wolves, which we won't, but if we do, don't run. Stand your ground, make yourself look big, and back away slowly. What if they attack?" "They won't." I adjusted my pack straps and headed into the forest. Wolves are afraid of humans. That's why Webb's story doesn't make sense. No wolf would approach a campsite with people in it, let alone display aggressive behavior. The trail started as a wide, well-maintained path through old-growth firs and cedars. Our footsteps crunched on fallen leaves and the occasional patch of frost that hadn't melted yet. Eddie stayed close behind me, his breathing slightly labored from the steady incline. 20 minutes in, the main trail split. I led us toward the eastern fork, where Thompson had spotted what might have been human footprints the day before. The path narrowed here, becoming less defined as it wound between massive tree trunks and overexposed roots. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" Eddie asked, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet forest. 15 years studying wolf behavior and pack dynamics. I've tracked them through every type of terrain the Cascades can throw at you." I paused to check a muddy section of trail for prints. Nothing obvious, but the ground was soft enough that we'd definitely see tracks if Chen had come this way. I've seen wolves do some pretty remarkable things, but what Webb described, that's not wolf behavior. So what do you think really happened? I knelt next to a fallen log, examining the moss and debris for any signs of disturbance. My best guess: Chen was sleepwalking or having some kind of psychological episode, maybe a reaction to medication, altitude, stress. Webb wakes up, sees his tent mate crawling around in the dark, making weird noises, and his brain tries to make sense of it by adding details that weren't really there. You think Webb was lying? Not lying, just mistaken. I stood and continued up the trail. When people are scared or confused, they often see what they expect to see instead of what's actually there. Webb probably heard stories about wolves before coming out here, so when he saw something strange, wolves were the first explanation his mind grabbed onto. The forest grew denser as we climbed higher, the canopy blocking out more of the early morning light. Our footsteps and occasional conversation were the only sounds. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, none of the usual forest activity I'd grown accustomed to during years of field research. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit, though I kept the observation to myself. Eddie was already nervous enough without me pointing out that the local wildlife seemed to be hiding from something. The Eastern Ridge Trail proved more challenging than I'd expected. 2 hours of steady climbing had taken us through increasingly rough terrain, where the maintained path gave way to game trails and deer tracks winding between massive boulders and fallen trees. My legs felt the burn of the constant incline, and Eddie's breathing had grown more labored with each mile. We'd stopped 3 times to examine possible signs of passage. A broken branch here, disturbed leaves there, but nothing definitive. Each time I'd knelt to study the ground while Eddie stood guard, his hand never straying far from his service weapon. His nervousness was becoming more obvious with every passing hour, manifesting in quick glances over his shoulder and the way he startled whenever a branch creaked in the wind. The forest remained unnaturally quiet. In 15 years of wilderness research, I'd grown accustomed to the constant background chatter of the ecosystem. Squirrels scolding intruders from overhead, birds calling to their mates, the rustle of small mammals moving through undergrowth. Here, we moved through an almost perfect silence, broken only by our own footsteps and the occasional crack of settling wood. I'd begun to notice other subtle signs that something was disturbing the local wildlife. Fresh deer pellets were scattered along the trail, but the animals that left them had clearly been moving fast, running rather than grazing. Several trees showed bark damage where deer had rubbed against them frantically, leaving tufts of coarse hair caught in the rough bark. The territorial markings I'd expect to find from the local wolf pack were completely absent, which struck me as odd for this time of year when they should be actively patrolling their range. Eddie's radio crackled to life just as we approached a small creek that cut across our path. The water ran clear and cold, maybe 6 inches deep, with muddy banks on either side that looked promising for tracking. "Team 2 to all units," came Thompson's voice through the static. "We found fabric caught on a branch cluster about 3 miles northwest of the main trail. Looks like pajama material. Matches the description of what Chen was wearing." Eddie keyed his radio. "Team 3 here. How far is that from our current position?" "You're probably 5 miles southeast of that location. But here's the weird part. We found more fabric samples another 3 miles north of the first site. If it's all from the same person, he's covered a lot of ground." I knelt beside the creek bank, studying the soft earth where Eddie and I would need to cross. The mud held impressions well, and I could make out the tracks of several deer that had come down to drink, along with what looked like raccoon prints near a fallen log. But there, clear as day in the center of the muddy bank, was something that made me pause. "Eddie, come look at this." He finished his radio check-in and crouched beside me, following my pointed finger to the ground. "Are those footprints?" "Human. Definitely." I pulled out a small ruler from my pack and held it next to the impression. "But look at the measurements." The footprint was bare, as I'd expected given that Chen had left his campsite without shoes. But the proportions were wrong in a way that made my chest tight with unease. The stride length between prints measured nearly 4 feet, longer than any human could manage during normal walking, and even longer than most people could achieve while running. Maybe he was jumping from rock to rock, Eddie suggested, though his voice carried doubt. I measured the depth of the impression, using my finger to gauge how far the foot had sunk into the soft mud. A person Chen's size, running hard enough to take 4-foot strides, would leave impressions maybe half an inch deep in mud this consistency. These are closer to 2 inches. What does that mean? I sat back on my heels, staring at the tracks. Either Chen weighs twice what his tent mate reported, or he was moving with significantly more force than should be possible for someone his build. We crossed the creek carefully, following the line of prints as they continued up the opposite bank. The footprints led away from the water in a straight line for about 20 yards, then suddenly veered to the right for no apparent reason. 10 yards later, they turned sharply left, then right again, creating a zigzag pattern that made no sense for someone trying to navigate through forest terrain. "Looks like he was confused," Eddie said, checking his radio again. "Maybe hypothermia setting in?" Maybe. But I'd seen hypothermic patients before, and their movement patterns typically showed increasing lethargy and poor coordination, not the explosive force evident in these tracks. The direction changes are too abrupt. "And look at this." I pointed to a section where the prints crossed a small fallen branch. Instead of stepping over or around the obstacle, the tracks showed where feet had landed directly on the wood, splintering it into several pieces. He was running hard enough to just plow through anything in his way, I observed. But why? What was he running from? Or toward? Eddie's radio crackled again. This time it was Sergeant Rodriguez's voice, calling all teams for a position update. We'd been assigned grid coordinates to cover, and I realized we'd drifted slightly north of our intended search area while following the tracks. "Team 3, what's your current location?" I pulled out my GPS unit and read off our coordinates while Eddie relayed the information. "We're tracking human footprints heading north-northeast toward the rocky outcrops near Cascade Pass. Prints are approximately 2 hours old, maybe less." "Copy that. Team 1 found additional fabric samples 4 miles east of your position, but they're heading back toward base camp. Weather Service is calling for possible afternoon storms, so we want all teams back by 1600 hours. I checked my watch. Just past noon, which gave us 4 hours to continue tracking. The footprints we'd been following showed no signs of slowing down or changing direction toward shelter, which meant Chen was either still moving or had found somewhere to hole up in this wilderness. We continued following the erratic trail deeper into the forest. The trees grew larger and more densely packed here, their massive trunks creating a maze of shadows and hidden spaces. Old-growth cedars stretched over 200 feet overhead, their canopies so thick that the forest floor remained dim even in midday light. Eddie stayed close behind me, his earlier attempts at casual conversation now replaced by the focused silence of someone trying to listen for potential threats. Every few minutes he'd stop and scan the trees around us, his hand resting on his weapon. I found myself doing the same thing, though I couldn't have explained why. Something about the continued absence of wildlife sounds was starting to get under my skin. The tracks led us through a section where the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of pine needles and decomposing leaves. Here, the footprints became harder to follow, showing only as slight depressions and disturbed vegetation. But the pattern of movement remained consistent. Long, powerful strides, punctuated by sudden direction changes that seemed to serve no practical purpose. "Dr. Mitchell," Eddie said quietly, "I've been thinking about what that witness described. The tent mate, Webb. What about it? You said wolves don't move the way he described. But what if it wasn't a wolf he saw? What if Chen really was moving on all fours?" I paused next to a massive cedar trunk to consider the question. Humans can crawl on hands and knees, but they can't run that way. The biomechanics don't work. We'd need completely different joint structures and muscle attachments. But what if he wasn't running on hands and knees? What if he was running on hands and feet like... Eddie's voice trailed off. Like what? Like an animal. The idea was ridiculous, but I found myself examining the tracks more carefully. The stride length, the force, the random direction changes. None of it fit normal human movement patterns. But it also didn't match any animal I'd studied, including wolves. A branch snapped somewhere behind us. We both turned, scanning the trees we'd just passed through. but saw nothing moving in the dim light. Eddie's breathing had quickened, and I realized my own pulse was elevated, despite the lack of any visible threat. "Probably just a deer," I said, though I didn't quite believe it myself. We continued north, following the intermittent trail toward the rocky outcrops that marked the edge of our assigned search grid. The terrain grew steeper and more challenging, requiring us to use our hands to navigate around boulders and over fallen logs. If Chen had come this way in the dark, wearing only pajama pants, he would have been cut and bruised by dozens of obstacles. But the tracks showed no signs of hesitation or careful navigation. They continued in the same powerful erratic pattern, as if whoever made them had simply charged through the forest without regard for the terrain or their own safety. My radio produced a burst of static, then cleared to reveal Thompson's voice calling for another position update. I responded with our current coordinates and estimated arrival time at the rocky outcrops, but kept my growing concerns about the tracks to myself. Eddie was already nervous enough without me voicing my doubts about what we were actually following. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as we approached the edge of the rocky area where our trail seemed to be leading. Somewhere ahead, beyond the maze of stone formations and alpine meadows, Robert Chen was either waiting for rescue or had already succumbed to exposure and whatever had driven him to flee his campsite in the first place. But looking at the strange footprints we'd been following for the past 2 hours, I was becoming increasingly certain that when we found Chen, the explanation for his disappearance would be unlike anything I'd encountered in 15 years of tracking wolves through these mountains. I knelt beside the massive bull moose, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. 3 hours of following the increasingly erratic trail had led us to this small clearing near Sahale Creek, where the animal lay sprawled across a patch of flattened grass that was still damp with blood. Eddie stood at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and his hand gripping his radio like a lifeline. "Jesus Christ, David, what the hell happened here?" The moose had died recently. The blood hadn't fully coagulated, and there was no smell of decay despite the afternoon warmth. I'd encountered plenty of predator kills during my years of wolf research, but this was unlike anything in my experience. The wounds to the throat and chest were massive, jagged tears that had opened the animal's major arteries and exposed the ribcage beneath. But there were no claw marks, no bite patterns, no teeth impressions in the flesh. I pulled on latex gloves from my field kit and examined the edges of the wounds more closely. The tissue showed crushing damage consistent with incredible force, but the tears themselves looked like they'd been made by fingers rather than any natural weapon I could identify. "Eddie, you need to see this." He approached reluctantly, keeping his distance from the carcass. "I don't want to see it. I want to call this in and get backup out here. Look at the proportions." I held my own hand over one of the bloody impressions pressed into the moose's hide. The handprint was human in shape. 5 distinct fingers, opposable thumb, palm structure that matched our species exactly. But the size was wrong. Maybe 30% larger than my own hand, with finger spans that stretched beyond what should be anatomically possible. The bull moose would have weighed at least 1,200 pounds. I'd studied wolfpack dynamics for 15 years, and even a coordinated group of 8 or 10 wolves would struggle to bring down an animal this size. A single human, regardless of size or strength, simply couldn't generate the force necessary to inflict this kind of damage with bare hands. "Call base camp," I said, standing and examining the area around the carcass. "Tell them we've found evidence of the missing person, but we need to update our search parameters." Eddie keyed his radio. "Base camp, this is Team 3. We've got a situation here that requires immediate backup." Static crackled through the speaker, followed by broken fragments of Thompson's voice. The words were too distorted to understand, but the tone suggested he was asking for our location and status. "Base camp, do you copy? We're at coordinates Eddie read off our GPS position twice, then tried switching to different channels. Each attempt produced the same result: static mixed with unintelligible voice fragments. I walked a slow circle around the moose, studying the ground for additional tracks. The human footprints were everywhere, overlapping and crossing each other in patterns that suggested frenzied movement rather than purposeful hunting. Some of the impressions showed the same unnaturally deep indentations we'd been following all day, but others were even deeper, as if the person making them had gained significant weight or was somehow exerting more force with each step. "The radio's not working," Eddie said, his voice tight with growing panic. "We're cut off. Mountain terrain interferes with radio signals. We'll regain contact once we get back to higher elevation." I crouched next to a section where the footprints led away from the carcass. "Look at this progression." The trail showed clear evidence of someone leaving the kill site, but the spacing between prints had become even more erratic than before. Some strides measured only 2 feet, while others stretched nearly 5 feet between impressions. The depth varied wildly, too. Shallow scuffs followed by indentations that had pressed more than 3 inches into the soft forest floor. Eddie joined me reluctantly. "It's like he was drunk, or having a seizure, or changing." The words came out before I could stop them, revealing a thought I'd been trying to suppress for the past hour. Changing into what? I stood and shouldered my pack, following the trail as it led toward a steep ravine that cut through the forest about 50 yards from the clearing. The footprints continued in their increasingly chaotic pattern, weaving between trees and overfallen logs with no apparent concern for efficient navigation. I don't know, but we need to keep tracking while the signs are fresh. Are you insane? Eddie's voice cracked slightly. Whatever did this to a 1,200-pound moose? We don't want to find it. We need to go back, get back up, get some real firepower out here. The late afternoon sky was deepening toward evening, with shadows beginning to stretch between the massive tree trunks. In another hour, we'd lose the light completely and be forced to continue by flashlight. But the tracks were clear enough that we could follow them even in partial darkness, and every hour of delay meant Chen was moving further away from our search area. "1 more hour," I said, checking my GPS unit to mark our current position. "If we don't find him by sunset, we'll set up camp and call for extraction in the morning." Eddie looked like he wanted to argue, but the radio crackled to life with another burst of static. This time we caught fragments of what sounded like Thompson calling all teams to report their status, though the words were too broken to respond to coherently. "Base camp knows where we are," I continued. "They'll send backup if we don't check in by our scheduled time. But right now, we're the only team close enough to follow this trail." The footprints led us down into the ravine, where a small stream cut through exposed rock and dense undergrowth. Here, the tracking became more difficult as the prints crossed back and forth over the water, sometimes following the stream bed for 20 or 30 yards before climbing back up one of the banks. Eddie stayed close behind me, his breathing audible over the sound of running water. He'd given up trying to radio base camp, but I could see him checking his weapon every few minutes, as if reassuring himself that he still had some form of protection against whatever we might encounter. The sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks as we climbed out of the ravine on the far side, leaving us in the gray twilight that preceded full darkness. I pulled out my flashlight and examined the next set of tracks, noting that they were becoming deeper and more widely spaced with each 100 yards we covered. Something was happening to Robert Chen, something that defied every principle of biology and physics I'd learned in 15 years of scientific research. But whatever it was, he was still out there in the wilderness, and we were running out of time to find him before the night made tracking impossible. The trail disappeared completely, just past a cluster of granite boulders that marked the beginning of a steep slope down toward Doubtful Lake. I crouched next to the last clear footprint we'd managed to follow, shining my flashlight across the rocky ground where any normal person would have left at least some trace of their passage. "Nothing," I muttered, sweeping the beam in a wider arc around the area. "It's like he just vanished." Eddie stood about 10 feet away, his own flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness as he examined the trees that lined this section of the slope. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset, and I could see his breath forming small clouds each time he exhaled. "David, you need to see this." The urgency in his voice made me stand quickly and move to where he was pointing his light at the trunk of a massive Douglas fir. Deep gouges ran vertically down the bark, starting about 8 feet off the ground and continuing down to roughly shoulder height. The scratches were parallel, spaced like fingers, and had cut through the outer bark to expose the pale wood beneath. I reached up to touch the highest marks, but couldn't get within 2 feet of them even with my arm fully extended. Bear sign maybe, though I've never seen claw marks quite this deep. Those don't look like claw marks to me. Eddie moved his light to illuminate a second tree about 20 yards away, which showed similar damage. And look how high they start. What kind of bear reaches 8 feet up a tree? The gouges were wrong in ways that made my scientific training rebel against what I was seeing. The spacing was too wide for any North American predator I could identify, and the depth suggested whatever made them had applied tremendous force while raking downward. But more troubling than the physical evidence was the pattern. These weren't territorial markings or feeding sign. They looked like something had been clawing at the trees in frustration or rage. My radio crackled with static when I tried raising base camp for a status update. Eddie's attempts on different channels produced the same result. Broken fragments of sound that might have been voices, but nothing coherent enough to understand or respond to. "We're in a dead zone," I said, studying my GPS unit to confirm our position relative to the surrounding peaks. "Radio waves can't penetrate this terrain configuration. We'll need to get back to higher elevation before we can re-establish contact." Eddie checked his watch and then swept his flashlight beam across the rocky slope that descended toward the lake. "It's past 7. Thompson said all teams report back by 4. They'll be looking for us." The search coordinator would indeed be concerned about our missed check-in, but organizing a night rescue operation in this terrain would take hours. By the time backup reached our current location, we'd either have found Chen ourselves or lost any chance of tracking him in the darkness. "We set up camp here," I decided, shrugging off my pack near a relatively flat section of ground between 2 large boulders. "First light, we can resume tracking and work our way back toward the main trail." "Absolutely not." Eddie's voice carried a sharp edge I hadn't heard before. "Whatever killed that moose is still out there. We're going back to the truck." I pulled out my sleeping bag and emergency shelter, laying them out while I considered our options. The temperature would continue dropping throughout the night, possibly reaching the low 20s by dawn. If Chen was still alive somewhere in this wilderness, another 8 hours of exposure would likely kill him, even if he'd found some form of shelter. "Think about it logically," I said, setting up my small camp stove to heat water for coffee. "Chen's been out here for almost 20 hours now. If we abandon the search, we're essentially writing his death certificate." Eddie remained standing, his flashlight beam moving constantly between the trees around us. "If we stay out here, we might be writing our own." The forest had grown completely silent around our small camp. During my years of wilderness research, I'd grown accustomed to the subtle sounds that typically accompanied nightfall. Owls calling from their hunting perches, small mammals moving through the undergrowth, the rustle of roosting birds settling for the night. Here, our voices and the hiss of my camp stove were the only sounds breaking an almost perfect quiet. "Something's wrong with this place," Eddie continued, his nervousness now open and obvious. "The radio dead zone, the way all the animals have cleared out, those marks on the trees. We need to get back to the vehicle while we still can." I poured hot water over instant coffee and handed Eddie one of the metal cups from my kit. "Drink this. The caffeine will help with the cold, and we both need to stay alert." He accepted the cup but remained standing, scanning the darkness beyond our limited circle of light. "I keep feeling like something's watching us." The comment made me pause in the process of setting up my shelter. Now that he'd mentioned it, I'd been experiencing the same vague unease for the past hour. A persistent sense of being observed that had no rational basis. In 15 years of wilderness work, often alone for days at a time, I'd learned to trust my instincts about potential dangers. But this feeling was different, more intense than the normal wariness that came with being in predator territory. A low growl drifted through the darkness from somewhere down the slope. Eddie froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips, while I turned off my camp stove and listened carefully for any follow-up sounds. The growl came again, deeper and more resonant than any wolf vocalization I'd studied. It seemed to roll up from the direction of the lake, echoing off the rocky terrain in a way that made it impossible to determine the exact source or distance. "Wolf?" Eddie whispered. I shook my head slowly. Wrong pitch, wrong duration. Wolves don't vocalize like that. Between the low rumbling growls, I caught fragments of what sounded like human whimpering. High-pitched, distressed sounds that lasted only a few seconds before being overwhelmed by more animal-like vocalizations. The combination was unlike anything in my experience, suggesting either multiple sources or something capable of producing both types of sounds. Eddie set down his coffee and reached for his service weapon. "We're leaving, right now." "Wait." I held up a hand, straining to hear more clearly. "If that's Chen, he's in distress. We can't just abandon him. That's not Chen. That's not human." Another series of growls echoed up from the darkness, this time accompanied by what sounded like branches snapping under significant weight. Whatever was down there was large enough to break through undergrowth rather than navigate around it, and the sounds were getting closer to our position. I reached into my pack and pulled out the tranquilizer gun I'd brought for potential wolf encounters. The weapon held enough sedative to drop a 200-pound animal, though I had no idea if the dosage would be effective against whatever was making those sounds. "You think that toy gun is going to stop something that can kill a 1,200-pound moose?" Eddie had drawn his service weapon and was holding it in a two-handed grip, pointed toward the source of the sounds. The whimpering came again, clearer this time and definitely human in character. Someone was down there in the darkness, either in pain or terrified, possibly both. But the low growls that accompanied the distressed sounds suggested they weren't alone. A loud crash echoed through the forest as something large collided with or knocked over a substantial tree. The impact was followed by the sound of heavy breathing that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if whatever was down there was moving rapidly between positions. "It's circling us," Eddie said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jesus Christ, it knows we're here and it's circling us." I checked the tranquilizer gun's safety and made sure I had a clear line of sight toward the slope below our camp. The breathing sounds were definitely getting closer, accompanied by what sounded like footsteps on loose rocks. Heavy, deliberate impacts that suggested something weighing several hundred pounds was picking its way up the rocky terrain toward our position. The beam of my flashlight extended maybe 50 feet into the darkness before being swallowed by the dense forest. Whatever was approaching us remained beyond that reach of light, visible only through the sounds it made as it continued its methodical advance up the slope from Doubtful Lake. I grabbed my pack and tranquilizer gun, rising slowly from my crouched position beside the camp stove. The breathing sounds had stopped completely, leaving us in a silence that felt more threatening than the approaching footsteps had been. Eddie's flashlight beam swept back and forth across the slope below us, searching for movement in the dense shadows between the trees. His service weapon remained pointed downward, though I could see his hands trembling slightly in the reflected light. "Where is it?" he whispered. Before I could answer, something massive slammed into me from the left side with the force of a freight train. The impact lifted me completely off my feet and sent me tumbling down the rocky slope, my flashlight spinning away into the darkness as I crashed through undergrowth and bounced off granite outcroppings. My shoulder hit a boulder hard enough to send lightning through my arm. Then my back scraped across rough stone that tore through my jacket and shirt. I rolled and slid for what felt like 50 feet before slamming into the trunk of a large cedar that stopped my momentum with a jarring impact that knocked the wind from my lungs. Above me, Eddie's voice rose in a scream that echoed off the surrounding rocks. The sound cut through the night air, raw with terror and pain, followed immediately by the sharp crack of gunshots. 3 rapid-fire reports from his service weapon. I pushed myself up on my elbows, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue during the fall. My flashlight lay somewhere in the darkness above me, but Eddie's light was still visible, casting wild shadows as it swung back and forth. In those brief illuminated moments, I caught my first clear glimpse of what had attacked us. The creature moved with impossible speed between the trees, a massive wolf-like form that stood nearly as tall as a man, but possessed the fluid coordination of something that had never been bound by normal physical limitations. Its fur appeared dark gray or black in the flashlight beam, but what held my attention were its eyes, glowing with an intelligence that was unmistakably human, focused and calculating rather than driven by animal instinct. It turned toward Eddie's position, and I saw the full scope of its size. The thing had to weigh at least 400 pounds, with shoulders broader than any wolf I'd studied, and legs that looked powerful enough to leap impossible distances. But it was the way it moved that violated everything I knew about animal locomotion. Fluid transitions between 2-legged and 4-legged gaits that should have been biomechanically impossible. Eddie's screaming stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. His flashlight beam went wild for a moment, then steadied into a fixed position, pointing uselessly into the trees. Complete silence returned to the forest. I crawled backward until I found a fallen log large enough to provide cover, then pressed myself against the rotting bark and tried to control my breathing. Blood ran down my face from cuts on my forehead, and my left shoulder felt like it might be dislocated from the impact with the boulder. Heavy footsteps moved through the undergrowth above me, deliberate and searching. The creature was hunting, tracking my position with patience that spoke to its intelligence. I reached for my field knife, the only weapon I had left after losing the tranquilizer gun during my fall down the slope. The breathing started again, much closer this time. Low, controlled exhalations that came from somewhere just beyond the log that sheltered me. I could hear it moving around my position, taking its time to plan its approach. When it lunged over the log, I had maybe half a second to react. The massive shape blocked out the stars as it descended toward me, and I drove my field knife upward with every ounce of strength I could manage. The blade connected with something soft and yielding, sinking deep into what I hoped was its eye. Warm blood sprayed across my hands and face as the creature released an ear-splitting howl that sounded both animal and human. A sound that seemed to contain rage, pain, and something like recognition all mixed together. The volume was loud enough to make my ears ring, echoing off the rocks and trees around us. The thing pulled back, my knife still embedded in its flesh, then bounded away into the darkness with the same impossible speed it had displayed during the attack. I heard it crashing through the forest as it retreated, leaving me alone with the smell of blood and the sound of my own labored breathing. I lay motionless behind the log for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. Every small sound in the forest made me tense, expecting another attack. My clothes were soaked with blood, some mine, some from the creature, and my body ached from the fall down the rocky slope. The cold was becoming a serious problem. Without my pack or sleeping bag, both lost somewhere above me in the darkness, the dropping temperature was starting to affect my ability to think clearly. I needed to move, to find Eddie, to get back to the vehicle before hypothermia made the decision for me. David. Eddie's voice echoed down from somewhere near our original campsite, weak but recognizably human. He called my name again, then added, "David, where are you?" I worked my way carefully up the slope, using trees and rocks for support as I climbed back toward where we'd been attacked. My shoulder sent sharp pain through my arm with every movement, but nothing seemed to be broken. Eddie's flashlight provided a beacon to navigate toward, though the beam wavered like he was having trouble holding it steady. I found him sitting propped against one of the granite boulders, blood running down the side of his face from a cut near his hairline. His service weapon lay on the ground beside him, and he looked dazed but conscious. "Jesus, I thought you were dead," he said when I stumbled into the circle of his flashlight beam. "That thing hit you like a truck. What happened after I went down the slope?" Eddie touched the cut on his head gingerly. "It came at me fast. I got off 3 shots. Think I might have hit it once. Then something knocked me backward and I hit my head on the rock. Woke up maybe 10 minutes ago." We gathered what equipment we could find in the darkness. My pack had landed in some undergrowth about 20 feet from our campsite, though the tranquilizer gun was nowhere to be located. Eddie's radio had been crushed during the attack. The plastic casing cracked, and the internal components scattered across the rocky ground. The hike back to our vehicle took over 2 hours. We moved slowly through the forest, supporting each other when the terrain became difficult and stopping frequently to rest. I kept checking behind us for signs of pursuit, but the creature seemed to have disappeared completely after our encounter. My field knife was gone, probably still embedded wherever I'd managed to drive it during the attack. The memory of that moment, the sensation of the blade sinking into flesh, the spray of blood, the inhuman howl, played over and over in my mind as we navigated the dark trails back toward the parking area. Eddie didn't talk much during the return hike. He moved like someone in shock, following my lead without question and jumping at every sound the forest made around us. Whatever he'd seen during those few seconds of direct confrontation had shaken him as badly as my own encounter with the creature. We reached the truck just as dawn broke over the mountain peaks, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly normal after the night we'd experienced. Both of us were shaking from cold and adrenaline, our clothes torn and bloodied. But we were alive. Eddie collapsed into the passenger seat while I started the engine with hands that trembled so badly I could barely grip the keys. The familiar sound of the truck's motor and the warmth from the heater vents felt like returning to civilization after months in the wilderness. Neither of us spoke as I drove down the winding mountain road toward the ranger station. What we'd encountered up there defied explanation, challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. But we were alive, and for the moment, that was enough. I sat in the cramped office at the back of the ranger station, watching Thompson arrange manila folders on his desk while 2 men in dark suits flanked the doorway like bookends. My shoulder ached from the previous night's impact with the boulder, and the cuts on my forehead had been cleaned and bandaged by the paramedic who'd examined us when we first arrived. Eddie occupied the metal chair beside me, his own head wound dressed with white gauze that made him look more like a casualty than a police officer. The search coordinator cleared his throat and opened the top folder. Robert Chen's body was recovered this morning by Team 3, approximately 2 miles north of where you lost his trail. Cause of death appears to be a bear attack. The words hit me like a physical blow. I leaned forward in my chair, studying Thompson's face for any sign that he understood what he was saying. A bear attack? Did you examine the wounds yourself? The medical examiner will conduct a full autopsy, but the preliminary assessment shows claw marks and bite patterns consistent with an aggressive black bear. Thompson's voice carried the rehearsed quality of someone reading from a script. The victim was found partially buried under brush and debris, typical bear behavior after a kill. One of the suited men stepped closer to the desk. He was probably in his 50s, with gray hair and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time indoors. His partner remained by the door, younger and broader, with alert eyes that never stopped moving around the room. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm Special Agent Barnes from the Fish and Wildlife Service. This is Agent Crawford. We need to discuss the incident you and Officer Santos experienced last night." I looked from Barnes to Crawford, then back to Thompson. "Fish and Wildlife? Since when does the federal government send investigators for local bear encounters?" Barnes pulled out a leather portfolio and set it on the desk. "When those encounters involve endangered species in protected wilderness areas. Your report mentions discharging a tranquilizer gun and using a field knife against what you perceived as a threatening animal. Those actions require investigation under the Endangered Species Act." The carefully chosen words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. Barnes wasn't asking questions about what we'd seen. He was building a legal framework to control what we could say about it. "The creature that attacked us wasn't a bear," I said. "The size, the behavior, the intelligence it displayed, none of that matches any known bear species." Crawford spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle southern accent. "Dr. Mitchell, you've been in the wilderness for over 12 hours under severe stress. You witnessed a fatal animal attack, were yourself injured in an encounter with dangerous wildlife, and experienced significant trauma. Eyewitness accounts under such circumstances are notoriously unreliable." Eddie shifted in his chair beside me. When I glanced at him, he was staring at his hands, unwilling to meet my eyes. The cut on his head looked worse under the office's fluorescent lighting, a stark reminder of how close we'd both come to ending up like Chen. Barnes opened his portfolio and withdrew several sheets of paper. "We've prepared statements based on your initial verbal reports to the Ranger Service. These documents describe your encounter with an aggressive black bear that had been displaced from its normal territory by recent drought conditions." He slid the papers across the desk to me. The typed text was single-spaced and filled most of the first page, describing in clinical detail an encounter that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened in the darkness above Doubtful Lake. "According to this," I said, scanning the document, "we observed standard bear behavior and used appropriate defensive measures when the animal became territorial. There's no mention of the creature's size, its intelligence, or the way it moved, because those details represent stress-induced misperceptions," Crawford said. "Black bears can appear much larger in darkness, especially to observers experiencing adrenaline responses. What seemed like intelligent behavior was likely normal predatory instinct." Thompson leaned back in his chair, looking uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "David, you've been doing wildlife research for 15 years. You know how easy it is to misidentify animal behavior under extreme circumstances." The betrayal in his words stung more than my physical injuries. Thompson had worked with me on multiple research projects, had seen my methodical approach to data collection and analysis. Yet here he was, suggesting I couldn't distinguish between a bear and the creature that had nearly killed us. Barnes tapped the papers with his pen. Dr. Mitchell, discussing endangered species encounters outside official channels violates federal statutes. Publicizing unsubstantiated claims about unknown animals in protected wilderness areas could trigger unnecessary public alarm and endanger ongoing conservation efforts. The threat was delivered in the same professional tone he'd used to introduce himself, but the implications were crystal clear. Sign the documents and keep quiet, or face federal prosecution under laws designed to protect wildlife. Eddie finally looked up from his hands. "What happens if we don't sign?" Crawford answered without hesitation. "Obstruction of federal wildlife investigation, interference with endangered species protection protocols, potentially criminal charges depending on how broadly the prosecutor wants to interpret your actions." I read through the statement again, noting how every detail had been sanitized to fit the official narrative. The impossible stride length in Chen's tracks became erratic footprints consistent with hypothermic disorientation. The massive handprints on the dead moose were described as claw marks from multiple bear attacks over several days. Even our radio malfunction was explained as atmospheric interference common in mountainous terrain. "This is complete fiction," I said. Barnes retrieved a pen from his jacket and placed it next to the papers. "This is an accurate account of a standard wildlife encounter processed through proper federal channels. Your signatures confirm that you understand the legal requirements surrounding endangered species protection." Thompson cleared his throat again. "David, Eddie, you've both been through a traumatic experience. The important thing is that you survived and we recovered Chen's body. Sometimes the details matter less than the outcome." The search coordinator's attempt at reassurance felt like another betrayal. These people were asking me to lie, to deny the evidence of my own senses, to abandon everything I'd learned in 15 years of scientific research. But the alternative was legal action that would destroy my career just as effectively. Eddie reached for his pen first. He signed both copies of his statement without reading them, his hand moving mechanically across the signature lines. When he finished, he set the pen down and returned to staring at his hands. I held the pen for a long moment, weighing my options. Everything in my scientific training rebelled against signing a document I knew to be false. But Crawford's implicit threats carried real weight, and fighting the federal government over something no one would believe anyway seemed like professional suicide. My signature looked shaky when I finally wrote it, the letters uneven from the tremor in my hand. Barnes collected both sets of documents immediately, sliding them back into his portfolio, like evidence being secured. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "You'll receive copies of these statements for your records. We trust you understand the importance of maintaining consistency with these accounts in any future discussions of the incident." Crawford handed each of us a business card. "If you have any questions about federal wildlife protection statutes, or if anyone approaches you seeking information about this incident, contact us immediately." They left without another word, their footsteps echoing down the hallway toward the ranger station's main entrance. Thompson gathered his remaining folders and stood up from behind his desk. "I know this isn't easy," he said, "but you did good work out there. Chen's family will have closure, and that's what matters." The search coordinator's words followed me as I walked to my truck in the parking lot. Eddie had already left, driving away in his patrol car without saying goodbye. I sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes, staring at Crawford's business card and trying to process what had just happened. Within a week, I submitted my resignation to the Washington State Wildlife Service. The letter was brief, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue other opportunities. My supervisor accepted it without question, probably relieved to avoid any complications from my involvement in the Chen incident. Packing up my research files took longer than I'd expected. 15 years of field notes, behavioral observations, and data analysis filled dozens of boxes that I loaded into a rented trailer. Most of the material documented normal wolf behavior, territory marking, pack dynamics, hunting patterns, social hierarchies. All of it seemed irrelevant now. Observations of creatures that represented only a fraction of what actually existed in the wilderness. The job with Portland Parks and Recreation was exactly what I needed. Indoor work with no fieldwork requirements, managing trail maintenance and visitor safety programs from an office downtown. My new colleagues knew I had a background in wildlife research, but they didn't ask many questions about why I'd changed careers. Months later, I found myself scanning online news reports from the North Cascades with obsessive regularity. Missing hikers, unexplained animal attacks, reports of strange sounds echoing through the mountains at night. I read every story, searching for patterns that might indicate the creature was still active. Most of the incidents had conventional explanations. Hikers got lost due to poor planning or bad weather. Bears occasionally attacked when surprised or defending cubs. Strange sounds usually turned out to be owls, coyotes, or wind passing through rock formations. But some stories didn't fit the standard patterns. A group of experienced backpackers found dead near Cascade Pass, their injuries too severe for any known predator. Radio equipment failing throughout the Eastern Ridge area during otherwise clear conditions. Game cameras that stopped functioning or captured blurred images of something too large and fast to identify. The official explanations always involved bears, equipment malfunction, or human error. No mention of creatures that moved with impossible speed, demonstrated human-level intelligence, or left handprints too large for any documented species. I'd stopped having the nightmares about those glowing eyes, but they still appeared in my memory during quiet moments at work, or when I was walking through Forest Park in the evenings. The intelligence behind those eyes had been unmistakably human, but the body that housed it violated every principle of biology I'd studied. Sometimes I wondered if Eddie still thought about that night above Doubtful Lake. I'd looked him up online and learned he'd transferred to a desk job with the Seattle Police Department, processing paperwork and avoiding field assignments. Maybe the federal investigators had been right about stress-induced misperceptions. Maybe our minds had created impossible memories to cope with a traumatic but conventional bear encounter. But I still had Crawford's business card in my wallet, and sometimes I found myself reading the federal wildlife protection statutes he'd referenced. The laws were real enough, and their enforcement would be swift and unforgiving for anyone who violated the official narrative about endangered species in protected wilderness areas. The creature we'd encountered was still out there, somewhere in the mountains of the North Cascades. The knowledge ate at me like a slow poison, the certainty that I'd signed documents denying the existence of something that challenged everything science claimed to know about the natural world. I'd built my career on empirical observation and evidence-based conclusions. Now I spent my days managing city parks and pretending that the most significant discovery of my professional life had never happened.